You are listening to episode 15 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Janice Marturano joins us to speak about her new book, Finding the Space to Lead, a practical guide to mindful leadership. Mindfulness may be thought of less as a technique, so much as a way of engaging with every moment in our lives. As such, it is finding a home in everything we do, and we can bring compassionate awareness into some places we might not have considered while wearing our stress reduction goggles. Certainly, stress reduction can be an outcome of our regular practice, but how can we bring that into how we think of leadership? And what do we even mean by leadership? Maybe our job title isn't what shows us to be leaders, but what we do every moment in our daily lives. Janice Marturano is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Mindful Leadership, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training and supporting leaders in the exploration of mindfulness and leadership excellence. She founded the Institute of Mindful Leadership in January 2011 after ending her 15-year tenure as Vice President, Public Responsibility, and Deputy General Counsel for General Mills, Inc. Janice was a strategic leader within General Mills before leaving to dedicate herself full-time to the Institute. While a corporate officer at General Mills, she co-developed the very first mindful leadership curricula at the University of Massachusetts Medical School's Center for Mindfulness, where she served as a volunteer member of the advisory board. As a certified teacher of mindfulness and an experienced former officer of a Fortune 200 company, she has brought the intensive training of mindful leadership to leaders from all forms of organizations: corporate, nonprofit, academic, government, and military. In 2013, she was invited to share her understanding of the importance of mindful leadership at the World Economics Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Special thanks to Summer Smith of Bloomsbury Publishing for her coordination of today's interview. Our guest today is Janice Marturano. Janice, welcome to Present Moment.
Thank you, Ted. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're here to speak about your new book, but let's start by having you tell us a bit about your background. How did you first encounter mindfulness?
Oh, it was about the turn of the century, around the year 2000, and I was, like most of us, doing the 21st century juggling act. So I was honing my skills as a 21st century juggler. And some of the balls that were in the air for me were I was a vice president of General Mills. I was a spouse, a mother. I was the daughter of aging parents, and I was a very active community volunteer. So I had all the balls in the air and with juggling seemingly faster and faster every day, but sort of getting it done. And then one day I was called down to the CEO's office for General Mills and was told that General Mills was going to acquire Pillsbury, and that it would be my job to work with a team, to lead the team in getting clearance from the government for the acquisition. And so this wasn't just adding another ball to the juggling act. It became such a complex deal that the deal that should have taken 3 or 4 months ended up taking 18 months of often 12-hour days, 7 days a week. And we were working pretty flat out and exhausting every bit of knowledge and creativity that the team had, that each of us on the team had. And during that same 18-month period, I would lose my mother and amazingly, a few months later, my father. So a very, very, very difficult time for me. At the end of the 18 months, I was expecting that I would bounce back. My original training was as a deal lawyer. I was a corporate strategist, so doing deals shouldn't have been that unusual, but this was an extreme deal. And yet I didn't bounce back. I started doing my juggling act again, but something felt missing. Something felt different. On the outside, I suppose it looked like I was back doing what I always did. And certainly the hours were more normal crazy instead of extremely crazy. But I knew and felt pretty profoundly that something had been lost during that period of time, although I had no idea what. A good friend of mine suggested that what I really needed to do was to go away to a spa and have some time to sleep well and eat better and just rest. And that then I would feel that resiliency come back. But the idea of going away to a spa at that time in my life was simply not in the realm of possibilities for me. I had, during that 18 months, had to send my family on vacation without me, my 2 school-age children, and my wonderful husband, because I couldn't get away from the deal. It was at such a critical point. And the last thing I could see myself doing was going home and telling my family, who had been missing me for those 18 months, that I was now going to go away on vacation to a spa without them. So that wasn't in the cards. But this friend was persistent and one day sent me an email. And the email was the top 10 spas in the country. It was a Sagat survey. And at the top was a place called Miraval in Arizona. And I opened the link, and that day I had had another night where I wasn't sleeping all that well. And during that 18 months, I had lost quite a lot of weight. And I opened the link, and it looked beautiful. The place just looked restful and wonderful. But still, I couldn't get myself to go. And in fact, at that point in my life, I'd never been to a spa. I'm happy to say, Ted, that that has rectified itself in the years since. But there was a little program off on the side of the website's homepage that caught my eye, and it was called The Power of Mindfulness. So I looked at this special program and I read about it, and I saw it was being offered by someone named John Kabat-Zinn, and I had no idea who he was. But I began to look into it a little more and look into John's background and what this whole mindfulness thing was. And I think I eventually went home to my family and spoke, especially with my husband, about this sort of intensive retreat. And in some ways, in my mind at that point, the fact that it was intensive for executives might have made it a little okay. And so it wasn't about going off to a spa, but it was about this intensive training of the mind. So I went. And for 6 days, there were 12 of us with John learning about mindfulness. And I think to this day, I would still count it among the 10 hardest things I have ever done. Because for 18 months, I was running 150 miles an hour, and it was like hitting a brick wall. Actually stopping, actually getting closer in touch with what is it like to be present and how much of my life I wasn't present for. And that began my journey of developing a meditation practice. And after John, I had many wonderful other experiences and learning about both the neuroscience of this and the meditation practice itself.
So after you'd had this experience and started deepening your own practice, you then returned to your company. You had an executive leadership position. What happened next?
For the first few years of developing my own practice, I was very much a closet meditator and had no idea how my colleagues would understand the fact that I was a meditator, and whether they would think that I was now no longer a dedicated vice president, or that I would somehow be unable to be clear and strong and do my job. And so I didn't really speak about it. And for me as well, it was such an exploration. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it myself in those early years. But fairly quickly, I began to see that this practice was beginning to intertwine with my other very strong thread in my life, which was the development of leadership. So I mentored many, many, many people. I managed a large team, and I was engaged with any number of strategic projects where I was working with colleagues very closely on difficult and sometimes challenging, sometimes groundbreaking kinds of projects. So I began to become more and more curious about this intersection between leadership development and mindfulness. And at one point, I began to see so many opportunities where this training would simply make it more possible for the colleagues that I cared so much about to be more of themselves and to do more of what they really wanted to do as leaders, that it no longer was possible for me to not try and see if a mindful leadership curriculum could be developed and presented in a way that would be accepted.
What did you find to be the most challenging thing about starting the mindfulness program that you did develop in the corporate world? What guidance might you provide to others considering that?
Well, when I looked at what might give this work the best chance of allowing individuals and then ultimately their teams and departments in the organization to go through a transformative process, it was very clear to me that the training is applicable to everyone, but it needed to start at the top. And so when I began to reach out and speak about my experience and the possibility of learning mindful leadership on a 4-day retreat, the people that I reached out to were directors and officers at General Mills. And it was that very first group of brave souls who really didn't know anything more about it than my experience and what I was speaking about, because that long ago, there was very little out there beyond MBSR, and there certainly was no mindful leadership. And so this was all brand new. And after that first group went off on retreat, and I co-developed that first curriculum with Saki Santarelli of the Center for Mindfulness, we took that first group out there. When they came back to General Mills and colleagues said, well, what was that like? What did you do? And their only answer was, I can't even explain it. You just have to go. Next time Janice does this, just go. And that was the beginning of a viral spread, leader telling leader. And within 2 weeks of the first group going, what happened was exactly what I expected to happen, because I knew my colleagues at General Mills so well, which is one of the vice presidents came to my office and said, I was so touched and moved and changed by what I have learned and have begun with the combination of this mindfulness and leadership, that I want every employee in my division to know it, but I can't send them all away on retreat. So what else have you got? And that was the development of the first 7-week course called Mindful Leadership and Wellness. That's for all employees.
So out of this grew the Institute for Mindful Leadership. What prompted you to move from this executive leadership position in a Fortune 200 company to work in the nonprofit sector?
Well, Ted, the first 5 years of mindful leadership training, I was both the vice president and I was co-developing and then developing curriculum and teaching mindful leadership. But since 2008, Saki and I had been offering these retreats to leaders from around the world. And the demand had grown so much that by the end of that 5-year period, I had 2 full-time jobs and simply had to make a choice. And we knew that mindful leadership did not belong in a medical school, which is where the center is, and that it felt to me and to Saki that it should have its own home. And so I began to give some thought to developing a nonprofit that would house and be dedicated to this unique intersection of mindfulness and leadership. And that's what the Institute for Mindful Leadership is. And in December of 2010, I founded that nonprofit. And by the middle of 2011, I had left General Mills and worked full time for the nonprofit.
So we've been using a term leader quite a lot just in our conversation so far. Tell us a little bit more about what you mean by leader and leadership.
I spent more than 25 years in organizations and in positions that are designated as leaders for most of that 25 years. But what I know is that every single person is a leader, because leaders are people who influence. And every single one of us influences, for better or worse, the people around us, the communities in which we live and work and play. The question is, how do we cultivate our capacity to lead with excellence and to live with excellence? So at the core of the development of this leadership excellence are what I call 4 fundamentals of leadership excellence. They're the 4 qualities that, if you cultivate these 4, you will lead with excellence, you will influence with excellence, and you will live, I think, with excellence. And the 4 are focus, clarity, creativity, and compassion.
Let's talk a little bit about each of those as we segue into your book, which is titled Finding the Space to Lead, A Practical Guide to Mindful Leadership. There's a lot in that title. As we were talking earlier before the interview, that's as dense as poetry, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit. Can you tell us a bit about just starting with the finding the space part?
Sure. What I experienced myself and what I would hear from leaders everywhere in all kinds of organizations, because I've taught leaders from for-profits, non-profits, military, government, any kind of organization you can think of. I have had the great honor of working with leaders from those organizations. And time again, I would hear and know from my own experience that the best leaders are people with bright minds and warm hearts, and they don't have a sense that they're doing their best work. They don't have a sense that they're being fully who they are capable of being. And when I started to become curious about this and ask folks, well, if you could have anything you wanted to make it easier for that to happen, what is it you would want? No one ever said they needed more resources or they needed more money or they needed, more creative teams or any of that stuff. In one way or another, the answer that came back is, I just need some space. I need some space because my days are what I used to call gray days, right? Back to back to back to back meetings. And the reason I call them gray days is if you printed a calendar out on Outlook that looked like that, it would come out all gray.
It was all gray and layers of gray.
There you go, right? So if you're in the corporate world, you know about gray days. And so, yeah, you have gray days. Alongside that gray day, you have a task list that's miles long. Well, if there's no place in the gray day, how could you possibly get the tasks done? And then you go home, but you're not really fully there. So when you're home, you think about work. When you're at work, you think about home, and you're constantly distracted. And that's not even mentioning how our minds tell full-length feature films that keep us busy, even when we're trying to focus. So finding the space to lead, finding the space is about how do we train our minds? How do we embody presence? How do we open our hearts in a way that actually cultivates our ability to know how to have that space, to experience that space? So finding the space to lead, as you mentioned, Ted, is followed by a subtitle called A Practical Guide to Mindful Leadership. I knew that if I brought a curriculum into an organization that began by telling people, okay, everybody, go sit on a cushion for an hour, that's not making it past the day one, the hour one. And I also knew after years of exploring and research and understanding, and lots of people helping me to understand more about the effects on the brain, and then experimenting with myself and some wonderful colleagues who helped do this and developing the curriculum, that a combination of sort of traditional sitting or walking practice and learning how to take what we call purposeful pauses, where you have these little mini training sessions all day long, are two of the three parts of mindful leadership, and that those two together are very powerful and very effective in beginning to practice and understand what mindful leadership is, and in beginning to cultivate that space. The third prong of the training of mindful leadership is the power of reflection, and it's specifically tied to what creates that creativity, that clarity, the compassion, that are the three of the four pieces, along with focus, that combine to form leadership excellence. And the power of reflection that we begin to train with are things like, what does it mean to lead with excellence? What are my leadership principles? And we get into questions around, what inspires me? And all of these are reflections that, of course, also require that you have space to actually engage in reflection, and that you have some understanding of how to do it or how to experience it. So those are the three pieces: the meditation itself, purposeful pauses, and the power of reflection. And in the book, Finding the Space to Lead, each of those is explained and explored, and the book itself has a website with downloadable meditations and reflections, so that it's very much a practical guide that you can begin yourself, that you can start, get the book, go to the website. And that was the intention that I had with this, is say, well, what is mindful leadership versus MBSR in a company? And can I help people kind of get their arms around this in a way that's simple?
Janice, what's been the most rewarding experience to you in the creation of the Institute and in the writing of the book? What is it that's inspired you most in this process?
Some people have asked me about whether the decision to leave General Mills as a vice president and to move into the nonprofit world with the Institute and dedicate myself to this work was a difficult decision. And from the outside looking in, you might think that it would be, because I had a wonderful job at General Mills. I loved it. I think the people I worked with were terrific. And yet, in the 5 years where I was doing both, on retreats and in courses, and people would stop me in the hall and we'd talk about their experiences and what made a difference, and how deeply they were touched by what they were beginning to explore, and how their families were changed by it, how they were changed by it, how their teams were changed by it, that there was just simply nothing else in my professional world that had ever given me this great gift of being able to touch so many lives in such a wonderful way. And of course, not about me, but about opening the door for others and seeing that unfolding for them. And it simply has been an extraordinary unfolding that I never had planned for and never would have expected.
Yeah, it's interesting how some of the most fulfilling work we do has nothing to do with us.
Absolutely. I'm always saying that about this work. And I have a great deal of compassion and caring for the people who are doing that 21st century juggling act. It's extraordinarily difficult to lead with excellence today, whether you're leading your household or a global organization. It is just a much more complex and chaotic thing to do. And to me, I don't think this is a nice to have anymore. I think we absolutely need people to be able to know how to train more of their mind's capacity and how to open their hearts more to be more of who they are, not to change anybody, not to change the world around them, but to be more of who you are.
Very well said. Let's segue a bit to the Mindful Leadership blog on Huffington Post and a challenge that you have coming up and an opportunity that you have coming up. Tell us a bit about all of that.
Right. Okay. So we are in the middle right now of a 5-day Mindful at Work challenge with Huffington Post, and that's part of the partnership we have between the Institute and HuffPost. And it's also part of the new section in Huffington Post called Mindful Leadership. So I do write a blog for the Mindful Leadership pages, as do other instructors at the Institute and participants who care to do that. So under the Mindful Leadership banner, those pages on HuffPost have stories of people's experiences or also have things that the instructors at the Institute and I offer up. In this Mindful at Work challenge, we've invited people who are interested to sign up, register for free, and they have been getting an email every morning that has a guided meditation and then some very practical, purposeful pauses and practical tips to apply what they're learning each day. So without taking more than 10 or 15 minutes a day, can you begin this training of the mind and these changes that are a part of mindful leadership? At the end of it, we're going to be announcing, and I'll announce right here with you, Ted, as well, that on February 12th, Finding the Space to Lead online live workshop will launch. And there's information on the Institute's website for people interested in registering. And the first 50 people who register will get a huge, deep discount, more than 50% off the tuition rate, and a free audible.com version of Finding the Space to Lead. The course will be 4 Wednesdays, starting on February 12th, for 90 minutes in the evening, and we hope to form a very active community around mindful leadership.
Sounds wonderful, and I should correct you. It's the next 49 people, because I'm going to go ahead and register as the first one out there.
Well, thank you.
And Janice, you also have some retreats that are coming up as well.
Yes, we do. So we have a 2-day non-residential retreat coming up in Minnesota called Leading Differently, The Power of a Purposeful Pause, and that's going to be at the Minnesota Arboretum on March 20th and 21st. And then our flagship retreat, the first one of 2014, is our Cultivating Leadership Presence Through Mindfulness, and that's going to be in the Catskill Mountains of New York, and it will be on April 9th through the 13th. And that retreat always draws wonderful leaders from around the world, and this will actually be our 25th time of teaching that retreat.
So if you'd like to hear more about the work that Janice is doing, and in particular, I would encourage you to check out that online course. There are 2 websites for you, and of course, I'll be linking both of these on the episode page for this episode. The first is www.instituteformindfulleadership.org, and the second is for the book, findingthespacetolead.com. Our guest today has been Janice Marturano. Janice, thank you for joining us on Present Moment.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's been a pleasure.
Today's quote is from Janice Marturano's book, Finding the Space to Lead, A Practical Guide to Mindful Leadership. As you develop a meditation practice that sensitizes you to emotional content, you also become more familiar with how emotions influence your actions. As a result of suppressing your emotions less and taking the time to see them more clearly, you begin to detect the influence emotions have on your behavior. Perhaps you begin to notice that you become very short-tempered right after you feel the butterflies in your stomach. You might become aware that the butterflies appear when you're unsure about a situation, and this feeling of insecurity leads to the short temper. The next time you notice the butterflies, can you feel your temper rising and make a more skillful choice before you erupt? Little by little, we can all begin to learn more about who we are and how we behave. As we open ourselves to what is here, and stop expending energy pushing away or trying to deny what we're feeling, we find a bit of space in which we can intentionally choose our next step. We respond to the realities of our lives more consistently. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.